This is Anjum from YWCA Canada. We will be starting very shortly, as in right now. Thank you everyone who's joining us from across the country. We have 178 people on this call and counting. Tonight we're having our conversation about cybermisogyny in times of COVID-19 and beyond. And this is a partnered event between Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as LEAF, and YWCA Canada. For folks who have Twitter, we encourage you to continue this conversation online while you're in this event and really tweet some of the incredible pieces of wisdom and insights our panelists and moderator will be sharing. To tag LEAF, you'll see their Twitter handle up here, LEAF National. And for YWCA Canada, please tag us at YWCA_Canada. The hashtag for today's event is Gender Equity During a Pandemic. And this is actually the fourth event that we've had in our virtual series since the pandemic started. Our first one on April 1st was looking at the gendered impacts of COVID-19. We followed that up with an event looking at how communities across Canada have been responding to this crisis locally. And our third event focused on care during the pandemic, childcare, elder care, mutual aid networks, and social policy, and all the different ways care has been really holding our society up during this crisis. And we're really excited that our fourth session is focusing on this topic in partnership with LEAF, an organization we greatly value. I might have introduced myself a bit, but my name is Anjum Sultana. I am the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications, and I'll be guiding you through the first couple slides of this night. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. So we want to start off with a land acknowledgement, and we do a land acknowledgement to honor the First People. We're acknowledging the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land for time immemorial. In doing so, we also must recognize the harm that settler colonialism has perpetrated on this land in the past and continues to on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. This event is being viewed by people across Turtle Island. Many of the organizers are situated on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit of the First Nation. Tkaronto, also known as Toronto, is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. For land acknowledgements, we also like to talk about, I personally like to talk about my migration journey to this land. I was born in India many years ago, and shortly after, my family immigrated to Saudi Arabia, and we also spent some time in Yemen. And many years ago, my family came to Canada, and I've been here for a few decades since. And it's been an interesting journey thinking about my relationship to this land as a settler, but also as an immigrant and what that means, and what responsibilities I have to work in solidarity with Indigenous communities across this country and across this land. The last piece we wanted to share is to remember that as we engage online, digital spaces are often used as tools of oppression towards Black, Indigenous, racialized women, gender and sexual minorities, people with disabilities, and other community members who experience intersecting forms of marginalization. So let's do our best as we participate in this space to create it, to ensure that it's safe for everyone to engage. So speaking of engagement, for folks who've been on a Zoom webinar before, you may already know this, but if you have not, just want to situate you. For this event, we encourage people to write questions in the Q&A function. So you should see that in this area here towards the bottom of your screen or on the top. But if you go into that section, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the event. And our panelists will try and answer some of them, But if they don't, we'll be actually compiling these questions afterwards so people have a sense of some of the conversations that came out. And we'll see if we can share some resources in our follow-up email. We also encourage people to type comments in the chat. So at this point, I'd actually like to encourage people to share a bit about where they're coming from, where they're situated from, and what brought them to this event. So feel free to add those comments in the chat. We'll definitely be taking a look throughout the event. This is an event in partnership with LEAF and YWCA Canada. So I'll share a bit about our organization, YWCA. We're a national organization that has 32 member associations across 9 provinces and 2 territories. And what we do at YWCA are 2 main things. One is national advocacy. So working in partnership with our member associations across the country, we advocate to federal government on issues as they relate to gender equity. And we do this informed by the work our colleagues do on the ground. And we've been working on issues of gender equity for 150 years. So we're really leveraging and using the insights from our service delivery expertise to also inform public policy. And ultimately, we see these 2 aspects of our work working in partnership to really focus on systemic change and pushing for people-powered change. It's my honor now to introduce our moderator for the evening, Roselle Kim, who is a staff lawyer at LEAF. As a staff lawyer, she contributes to the development and management of LEAF's cases. She also conducts legal and research support to advance LEAF's work on litigation, law reform, and public legal education. She is the co-chair of LEAF's Cybermisogyny Advisory Committee, which is examining the potential legal responses to technology-facilitated violence against women that are informed by equality principles. And it's actually in her leadership in this role that this event actually came together in partnership with my colleague, Rain. So we're really grateful for this partnership and looking forward to the conversation that happens tonight. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to our moderator. Over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much, Anjum, for that great introduction and the acknowledgement. Wanted to say hello and welcome to all 270 of you who are in this webinar, which is really amazing. And I'm looking forward to the discussion that we'll have with all our panelists. So before I get into the discussion, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about LEAF and what it does. So we'll just move to the next slide. So the Women's Legal Education Action Fund, or LEAF, is a national, charitable, and nonprofit organization founded in 1985. So this is actually our 35th anniversary year. LEAF works to advance the substantive equality rights of women and girls in Canada through litigation, law reform, and public education using the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, notably sections 15 and 28. Our cases have resulted in landmark victories in preventing gender-based violence, eliminating discrimination in the workplace, allowing access to reproductive freedoms, and providing better maternity benefits, better spousal support, and a right to pay equity. So on that note, LEAF is concerned with the proliferation of misogyny and gender-based violence in the online world. And this growing problem, we believe, requires a principled feminist response. And out of this, our Cybermisogyny Advisory Committee was born. So our Cybermisogyny Advisory Committee brings together feminist lawyers and academics to research and discuss potential legal responses to technology-facilitated gender-based violence that are informed by equality principles. So before I begin, I just also wanted to state a positionality statement, just so you know where I'm coming from. So I identify as Korean, immigrant, and a settler who's living and working in what has been the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of their Credit First Nation. And I recognize that I hold immense privileges as someone who is cis, heterosexual, able-bodied, and light-skinned woman of East Asian descent with post-secondary education, including a law degree. And I come into this panel identifying my positionality here as a feminist practice because I want to acknowledge or to subvert the idea of neutrality and objectivity and to acknowledge that I have a lot to learn and unlearn. So with that note, I look forward to learning from our panelists here today and from all of you. Okay, so before I get into introducing our panelists, I wanted to quickly talk about what exactly do we mean when we say cybermisogyny. So with the term, we hope to highlight the gendered nature of online hate stemming from systemic racism, systemic sexism, and homophobia, ableism, and oppression. In November 2018, a UN women's human rights expert recognized cyber violence as a specific form of violence against women. And it's clear that women living at multiple intersections of oppression are being disproportionately targeted online as well. In a National Observer article from March 2020, Indigenous women activists reported an increase in racist comments as well as threats to their lives during the pipeline protests. Nikita Longman, an activist and organizer from George Gordon First Nation in Saskatchewan, said the most concerning aspect of online hate and threats towards Indigenous women was how often it went unchallenged. As Longman's account indicates, women with public profiles such as activists, community organizers, journalists, and politicians have disproportionately been targets of online harassment and hate. A 2018 study of Twitter by Amnesty International found that an abusive or problematic tweet is sent to a woman every 30 seconds on the platform. Black women were 84% more likely than white women to be mentioned in an abusive or problematic tweet. So with all that, now we add the pandemic, where many of us are subject to social distancing rules, which have been somewhat relaxed but still remain in place, and working from home. And this means that the digital space plays a much more important role in maintaining our social and professional connections. So it remains important now more than ever to talk about systemic solutions to make our digital space free from hate and violence. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists, Hadia Roderick, Susie Dunn, and Rebecca Pacheco, to delve into this topic further. So how this panel is structured is that I'm going to introduce each of them, where I will sort of ask them about their work in this area. And afterwards, we're going to open up the discussion with a few questions that I prepared, and we'll get to some of the questions that you've asked during the session as well. So let's move on. So I'd like to introduce Hadia Roderick, who is a researcher, consultant, lecturer, speaker, broadcast commentator, and former Bay Street employment and human rights lawyer. She's most well known for her viral piece, Black on Bay Street, which was a cover story for the Globe and Mail. She recently completed her PhD in organizational behavior at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, where her research focused on gender and parental bias in the professional workplace. Congratulations, Dr. Roderick, and I should have introduced you as that. She's on the board of LEAF and is a member of our Cybermisogyny committee. And you can follow her on Twitter at Hadia Roderick. So Hadia, you wrote an article recently for Vice Canada about online dating in the time of COVID-19. What did you find out, and what do you think the implications are from a gender and feminist perspective?
Sure. I mean, I am a Black woman on the internet, so I am no stranger to cyber misogyny and cyber misogynoir. I've just decided that that is a phrase that I am coining. And it's just kind of well known if you're a Black woman who writes about race that cyber misogyny is like part of the package. I think the first article I wrote, I got a tweet calling me a Negro bedwench. That was my, it was an interesting phrase to use. And even when I wrote my Black on Bay Street article, I was expecting to get a lot of online hate because, again, I was pointing out problems of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism in corporate Canada. And so surprisingly, I actually didn't get any hate mail as a result of that. I got two, I would say, mansplaining emails, but nothing that seemed really hateful. But even now, every time I write a post or I tweet or I share an article, I'm always ready. I have to be ready to mute or block people who seemingly sole purpose is to troll or antagonize. So I wrote this piece about dating. And I'm not on the market, but my sister was, and some other people that I knew were. So I was interested in what dating would be like in the era of COVID. And I spoke with a number of people, in particular, a lot of women. Women seem to be more open to talking about this. And I was quite amazed with the people recounting that they were sending nudes or, taking their phone into the shower and doing this with people that they hadn't met yet. And then another question that kept coming up was people were, this was sort of like in March, April, sort of the early times of the pandemic. And so a lot of these pandemic related online relationships were in their relative infancy, but they were already thinking about, how do I sexually advance this relationship when we can't touch each other? And so naturally what came to mind was, sharing intimate videos, sharing nudes, mutual masturbation, those kinds of things. And I was actually I was shocked that the people that I was speaking to that were in the younger generation weren't more concerned with potential negative uses of this information. And, it sucks. It sucks that people can't safely and freely share images consensually without the risks of having those images shared non-consensually. I don't think people are always clear or aware of the potential consequences. A lot of the sex trafficking that we have happens virtually. So if you may not have heard, but there's a South Korean sex ring where the ringleader is accused of forcing victims to perform degrading sexual acts and send him the videos, which he then uploaded onto what are called the infamous chat rooms on the messaging app Telegram that are collectively known as the nth rooms. And, that person has some horrific things that they've asked people to do. And there have been repercussions for people who have tried to get away from the sex ring. But we often have these illegal acts of sexual exploitation that happen in plain sight that usually start with the sharing of these images. So you'll have people who will groom young people for these images, or will pretend to be a fellow 15-year-old, but are actually a 42-year-old man sitting behind a computer somewhere. And then you have this spiraling effect and people kind of get sucked in who weren't expecting to get sucked into a sex ring. And the repercussions really are very different for women. I think a video of a sex tape that was leaked by a male politician would have very different repercussions than if it was for a female politician. And in case in the legal community, for example, we had the case of the former judge in Manitoba who had those photos who were published by her husband without her consent or her knowledge. And he had used the photos to try and get someone else at their firm to have a sexual relationship with either them or his spouse. And that person ended up bringing a lawsuit. And as a result, she then had to go through basically a hearing with the Canadian Judicial Council, even though this had nothing, she didn't do anything, she didn't share images, she didn't give consent for these images to be shared. But then the council ended up having to look at these images. She didn't have to be interviewed by people she had known had looked at these images without her consent, right? Because she didn't want the council to look at those images either. And in one article, she specifically mentioned she feels like if she had been a man, the reaction to the photos would have been different. She really, she didn't do anything wrong. She felt like she didn't do anything wrong, and that the council should have defended her rather than dragging her through this messy disciplinary hearing. And, she's the one who suffered the consequences. Her role was reduced. She ended up retiring early. Her direct quote is, "I lost my job. I lost my life. I lost my reputation." And what's to say, you're exchanging messages with some person you haven't met on the other side of the screen. And it's different if it's my partner of 4 years, but in this case, it was her partner of many years, and it clearly didn't make a difference. But, what happens if you share those photos and then that person turns around and decides to blackmail you for more photos? And if you can't trust Pornhub to take down rape videos, they're not going to take down your, consensual sex videos. So I think there's a lot that people need to wrestle with or think about before they share images. And it would be great if we had a world where we could trust people and we could feel safe, but I just feel like that's not the world that we live in. That's my very long answer to that question.
Thanks so much, Adia. And I think you touch on the important points of the acts not being wrong in themselves, but how their impacts can be so disastrous and detrimental to women specifically. And that's kind of the gendered.
Yeah, and they shouldn't be. Like, if I have nude photos out there, that's a body. We see bodies all the time. You see them at the beach if you go to France. It shouldn't be a big deal. But I think also that the way that we treat sex in North America, especially, I think also goes into how we react to those images. It shouldn't be a big deal to see a woman enjoying herself, enjoying sex. But unfortunately, we live in a patriarchal society that has some different ideas.
For sure. Thanks so much for sharing that. So I'd like to now introduce Susie Dunn, our next panelist. So Susie is a PhD candidate and part-time professor at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law. She's a research assistant with the Equality Project and a senior fellow with the Center for Innovation and Governance Innovation, where she works on issues related to technology-facilitated violence. Her research centers on the intersections of gender, equality, technology, and the law, with a specific focus on non-consensual distribution of intimate images, deepfakes, and impersonation in digital spaces. And you can follow her on Twitter at Susie M. Dunn with 2 N's. So Susie, could you provide us with a general overview on how Canadian law regulates digital space, including how it treats or does not treat harm suffered by recipients of technology-facilitated gender-based violence?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to give a shout out to some of the lawyers who are working in this area. I saw that there's lawyers from Gillian Yatu's firm. Molly Reynolds is doing amazing work on this. Angela Chason, Pam Crick. There's quite a few amazing lawyers who are already doing this work. I'm doing the academic side of things, but there are some fantastic practitioners who are out there doing work. I'm situated right now on the Algonquin territory, but I came to Canada. My family's been in Canada for many generations, and I was raised in northern Canada, in the Yukon, in the traditional territory of the Kwanlundun and the Ta'an. So a shout out to those wonderful people. But yeah, so the laws in Canada are quite broad for what could actually be covered. And here in Canada, we don't have any central organization that's creating statistics on the increase of this type of behavior. But if you're looking to other countries, like the UK, Australia, Pakistan, they're collecting data, and we're seeing increases during COVID of non-consensual distribution. The type of extortion that Hadia was talking about is becoming more common, and online harassment in general has seen increased numbers, particularly for gendered and other equality-seeking folks. So we are seeing that increase, but again, I think also the example that Hadia brought up with Lori Douglas, this isn't a new issue for us. You know, misogyny isn't new. The harassment that people are experiencing online, you know, the racism, the sexism, these are root issues that we need to address. And technology is just giving people a new tool for it. You know, in the same way that, you know, we express ourselves sexually, physically, in the same way that we express ourselves digitally, and we want to be able to do that safely. But unfortunately, you know, we live in a society where there's moments where there's sexual violence and our images are shared without our consent, and it creates real problems. Here in Canada, there's a variety of laws that you can look to that are meant to protect people who've experienced cyber misogyny. For criminal law, there's a wide variety of cases. If you're interested in looking at all types of law that cover tech-facilitated violence, I work with a group called the Equality Project, and we're creating a criminal law database that lays out the laws, the criminal laws that apply to these situations, and also some of the case law that exists. It's good until about 2018. We're just updating it now for some of the newer cases, but you can get a general sense of the laws that apply. And we'll send out a link with that. I believe Roselle will get a link out to everyone for that. For criminal law, I think some of the main areas of cyber misogyny that we're seeing are non-consensual distribution of intimate images and online harassment. So I'm going to focus a bit more on those issues. So the non-consensual distribution of intimate images is criminalized. Harassment is criminalized. You can also find identity fraud and impersonation, uttering threats, and voyeurism. And a case that I thought was particularly relevant for the COVID time, it came out of the Ontario Court of Appeal in 2019, is a case called R.V. Trinchy. And in that case, it was a couple that lived long distance from each other, a heterosexual couple. And they were, I just see a note, someone asking me to post the organizations, and I will later, that have the stats in the UK and Pakistan. But this case, it was a heterosexual couple that were engaging in a long distance relationship, and some of their Skype communications included sexual interactions. But the female in the partnership did not realize that her male partner was taking screenshots of the live sexual interactions they were having. And so she took him to court, and the question was, you know, is this voyeurism? Was this secret taking of photos? Because she had consented to having video-based images taken of her that were transmitted through a computer, but did that change when her partner started taking screenshots of her? And the Court of Appeal did say that, yes, this is different. You know, when you're engaging in digital sexual interactions, you know, when you change the type of transmission that it is from a live transmission to a recorded permanent transmission, that changes this person's reasonable expectation of privacy and switches something from what was a consensual sexual act to a criminal act of voyeurism. And so this is just one example of the way that the criminal courts are engaging with these types of issues. And I want to acknowledge too that, and I think we're going to talk a bit about this later, you know, that the criminal law has not always been the best place for everyone to access the supports they need for sexual violence. But it is important that the state recognize these types of harms. And so it is an option for people. Civil law is really interesting. Across Canada, we're you know, multi-jurisdictional country. So in each province, we have different privacy laws. You know, if you're in BC, there's the BC Provincial Privacy Acts where you can find supports under there. If you're in Quebec, they have really broad rights to your image, broad rights to privacy that are a lot more dignity focused, that are really interesting in Quebec. And then some provinces have actually developed their own non-consensual distribution legislation. And so that's in Alberta, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Saskatchewan. They've actually developed specific tort law or specific legislation for these types of harms. And some of the provinces, including Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, have a reverse onus. And the thing that's interesting about that is the person who's sharing the image in that context is expected to be able to show that they got consent. So the burden is on the person who shared the image rather than the person whose image was shared, which I think is a really important aspect of those laws. And then in Manitoba, one thing that I think is really excellent that they've done is they've actually legislated that there be a nonprofit body that assists people who've had their images shared. So you can not just go to the courts, but you can actually go to a nonprofit organization that's meant to assist you with these types of issues. And we're seeing these kinds of organizations popping up in Australia, in Ireland, in South Korea. There's a really amazing organization. And so it's great to see that Canada is starting to adopt that, at least in one of our provinces. Here in Ontario, we have the tort of the public disclosure of private facts that was recognized in 2 cases, one in 2016 and one in 2018, that basically says if any private information about you is released without your consent, published without consent, and it's embarrassing, then there's no legitimate reason for it to be published, then you've got a right under this tort. And both of those cases involves sexual images. One last case that I want to talk about is a case called Ywca versus Julian, and it's a 2019 Ontario court, a family decision. And in that case, they introduced this tort of false light. And what had happened in that case was that a father had access to his children, which he was filming, and then he was taking the content of what he was filming about his children and putting it online and saying things that weren't true about his kids, decontextualizing that information. And this was in a highly volatile family law situation. And so what the courts recognized in that case was that misrepresenting people in this way, the way that he misrepresented his children and misrepresented his wife, they're actually protected under civil law in Ontario, according to this case, which I thought was important because often in cyber harassment, we have true information shared about us that's private. We have decontextualized information, and then we have false information, and they're often shared all at the same time. You know, and so it's difficult when you have these torts where it's only private true information or only false information. So these torts allow a little bit more of a broad selection of options. And the last piece that I'll mention, and again, there's a wide variety of laws. These aren't all of the laws that could apply. The copyright could apply. But in British Columbia, their definition of family law violence or family violence is broad enough to include psychological and emotional abuse of a family member. And it includes intimidation, harassment, coercion, threats, and unreasonable restrictions on a person's personal autonomy. And we've seen cases in the BC family law courts where people who've been getting excessive text messages and emails from their partners, it has been recognized as a form of family violence, and there are circumstances where you can get a protection order. So that's just a broad overview of some of the laws that I thought were quite relevant, and I'll pass it back to Roselle.
Thanks so much for that very in-depth and accessible explanation of the laws, Susie. So last but not least, I wanted to introduce Rebecca Pacheco, who is a Projects and Communication Coordinator at YWCA Canada. She's driven by her passion for gender equity, and her research interests include technology-facilitated sexual violence and gender-based violence. She's leading YWCA's project, Not Online, Not on Campus, which is a research-based project aiming to address sexual violence and dismantle rape culture on post-secondary campuses. You can follow her on Twitter at BeccaP212. So Rebecca, I'm wondering if you could discuss some of YWCA's work in cybermisogyny, including some of the findings from the Not Online, Not on Campus project.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, my name is Rebecca. I'm the Projects and Communication Coordinator at YWCA Canada. And I just want to start off with saying thank you very much for having me here today, and for everyone that's tuned in for taking the time to listen and learn and talk about this, because it is an incredibly important topic and issue. So YWCA Canada has been involved in cybersecurity and safety work for some time, and with a focus on tech-facilitated sexual violence. And so we've engaged in different projects and various advocacy initiatives that pertain specifically to this line of work. So for those who don't know, we're a national organization, and we have 32 member associations across the country. And a vast majority of these associations provide frontline work to women and gender diverse people who are experiencing violence or fleeing violence. And that includes online tech facilitated violence. And so this puts us in a unique position as an organization to hear from the frontline workers and those on the ground engaged in this work and who are doing this on a daily basis. And so that it allows us to know that tech-facilitated violence, specifically tech-facilitated sexual violence, we know it's on the rise. And we're currently in the midst of a global pandemic, a pandemic that's forced our communications, our work, our relationships, our school, and all the other things to be facilitated online and over online platforms. And that makes this conversation that we're having here today more important than I think it's ever been. And so as an organization, we receive many Facebook messages from people around the world asking for support in dealing with tech-facilitated violence, oftentimes sexual violence. And we actually counted in between June of 2019 and March of 2020, we received 49 Facebook messages from people around the world. And these messages, again, were global and they were in various different languages. I think partly it's because YWCA has been involved in this work and we've had the opportunity to partner with different information, communication, and tech companies. And so people reach out to us for that support. And unfortunately, there are very little available resources, particularly that address this topic and talk about this topic and provide support for this. And so based on this, we know that this is a global issue. We know it's vast and we know it's complex and that it needs more time, attention, and dedicated efforts from all of us to talk about it. And talking about the research that we're working on, I'm currently engaged in YWCA Canada is engaged in a project called Not Online, Not on Campus. And this is looking at addressing sexual violence that happens on post-secondary institutions across the country and having a very deliberate effort to also include tech-facilitated sexual violence. And so we actually just finished up the first phase of the project, and this included a report. And so the report included focus group findings that came out of focus groups that our colleagues held at YWCA in Hamilton and also in Lethbridge. And so in going through these focus group findings, there were many interesting themes that came out pertaining specifically to the cyber world and tech-facilitated sexual violence. And so the most common understanding that came out of this from participants is that sexual violence online is on the rise and it's becoming normalized behavior and accepted behavior. And so particularly interesting, but also concerning, is that some people are no longer clear about what is considered online violence, as behavior that would previously be considered violent as inappropriate is now recognized as normal and therefore accepted. One participant actually said, "Whatever happens online is so normalized these days. Like some things I would think are probably really inappropriate and could fall under that umbrella of sexual violence. Maybe my daughter's experience, she would be like, well, that's just what happens. That's just normal." One participant mentioned, and I can certainly back this up anecdotally, is that from my peers and such, is that receiving an unsolicited nude photo has become quite normal. And so it doesn't elicit the same sense of rage and surprise anymore because it happens so frequently as it would have done the first time you received that. And so some participants were parents and they actually shared their experiences of their children in online sexual violence. And again, that it's becoming more normal and frequent and at an earlier age. And so we had parents with children in high school and middle school actually share this experience. One participant said, "My daughter was in middle school and was approached by boys to ask her to send naked pictures of herself. And so it's happening well before we think it is." And so our research really speaks to the occurrence of sexual violence, that it's becoming more common, it's becoming more frequent, and now recognized as normal behavior. And we know that our member associations working on the ground are having to transform their service delivery models and the supports they offer, as the changing landscape of the world and the type of violence that women and gender diverse people are disproportionately experiencing. As that change, our approach has to change with it. And our goal as an organization then is to build resources and tools for our member associations to provide that support on the front line, which is what this research is trying to do. It's trying to get that background knowledge. And our second phase now is to create a tool that we'll be able to share across our movement that they'll be able to implement in practice. So I'll pass it back over.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And thank you, Hadia and Susie, for sharing your work and your insights. I'm hearing that there's blurring of boundaries in general, that was happening before COVID, but also because things have been sort of exacerbated by our social distancing conditions, and also just the normalization of violence in the digital space. That's troubling in this area. And with that, I just wanted to now open up the discussion, focusing on potential solutions. So for all of you, I want to ask, what does an equitable digital space look like? And what do we need to do to get there? So I'll start with Hadia.
I mean, I don't think we'll have an equitable digital space until we have an equitable non-digital space. I don't think you can separate the two, and until we eradicate misogyny and sexism from our world, there will always be people who will exploit women. It's something that's unavoidable. So I would like to see a world where we don't have misogyny and where everybody is treated well and the same. And I don't know how we get there, to be honest. Like, you know, it's been a tough 2 weeks. I mean, if anything, we'll get there for white women first, and then it'll be catch up for women of color. If, you know, anytime I see articles about the gender gap, for example, it's always focused on that 78 cents or whatever that figure is, but that's the gender gap for white women. It's not the gender gap for women of color. It's not the gender gap for Black women, for Indigenous women. So an equitable world would be one where all women are treated equally, regardless of sexual orientation or gender expression or race, and where all people are treated equally. But I mean, we've got like 4,000, 5,000 years in the other direction. It's going to take us a while to catch up, unfortunately.
Sure. And I think that's also speaking to an important point, that these are not separate worlds, that, you know, online and offline distinction is moot, and one informs the other. So Susie, could I hear your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with Hadia, and like these are structural issues. You know, like we need to deal with the structural issues first, and you know, ideally we deal with those first, and then have a more equitable world in general. And of course, like looking at stats, like they're very much focused on white women. Even the idea of what we're afraid of is very much framed around like young white women's sexual images being shared. Where if you actually look at the like what is the worst harassment, that Toxic Twitter report showed that the first female Black MP was getting something around like 40 to 60% of all of the harassing tweets for all MPs across the UK. You know, and you see that kind of statistic that one Black woman for being a Black woman, for existing as a Black woman on the internet, you know, and she gets that level of online hate. And I think one thing that I really want to have people start thinking about is the concept of freedom of expression. Often when we're thinking about freedom of expression, there's this narrative that the best form of freedom of expression is to allow all forms of expression, you know, with very few limitations, and that by having both sides speak whenever they'd like, we can have equitable speech. But what we're seeing is that right now, without having some limitations on very hateful, misogynistic, racist speech, what is happening is we're driving a large portion of voices off of online spaces. And so when I conceptualize freedom of expression, I don't think of it as just something that we should be able to have spaces where we can say everything that we'd like, but to have spaces where we have the freedom to hear voices well. And that people can feel safe to speak out. Because the fact that if you think of CBC News had to shut down comments on any Indigenous story, not even political ones, but happy stories about Indigenous people, because the moment that an Indigenous story was written about on CBC, all the comment section was just vitriol against Indigenous people. And if that's a space that Indigenous people are expected to speak out on, when you get those types of responses, we don't have true freedom of expression. So I think we need to rethink what we're thinking about when we're talking about freedom of expression in digital spaces.
I think that's a really great point. And it also speaks to the fact that we don't all have equal platforms when we're here. And this idea of a marketplace of ideas is actually false, because some ideas are more promoted depending on the resources you have and the position you hold in society. So thanks for bringing that up, Susie.
I have a question and a point to jump off of there. I feel like there's a real misconception of what freedom of expression and freedom of free speech means for people, which I think drives a lot of people's negative responses to things. And so I see this especially in the US, but there's this concept that free speech means you can literally just say whatever you want without consequences. And there's this great comic by xkcd.com that, you know, right to free speech and the right to do what you want and say what you want really means the government can't arrest you for what you say. But it doesn't mean that anybody else has to listen to your nonsense or host you when you share it. It doesn't shield you from consequences. And a lot of people think that if they're yelled at or boycotted or banned from a community, that their, freedom of expression is being violated. But it's really just, according to the comic, and I agree, people listening think you're an asshole. They're showing you the door. But a lot of people seem to have troubles grappling with this comment, that you don't have the liberty to be racist, to be homophobic, to be transphobic, to be all of these things, and not suffer from the consequences of people thinking you're an idiot, or not wanting to listen to you, or not wanting to engage with you, or not wanting to host you on their platforms. But I wish that something we could do as lawyers is to clarify what that means for people, because there really seems to be this expectation that I am allowed to harass someone. I'm just saying what's on my mind. I'm just saying what I think, and people don't realize that it is hate speech in a lot of cases. We're also very terrible at prosecuting hate speech as well. So that's another thing we need to reckon with.
Yeah, for sure. Those are great points. Rebecca, did you want to add anything to?
Yeah, of course. And in asking the question, what does an equitable digital space look like? There's actually a great set of principles that were developed at the Gender, Sexuality, and Internet meeting. And this was organized by the Association of Progressive Communications. And so these are known as the Feminist Principles of the Internet. And these were created by 50 activists, advocates working in sexual rights, women's rights, violence against women, and internet rights. And so I think it could be a great place to look to as what a framework or a guideline might be. It's 17 principles, and these 17 principles are broken up into 5 sections, being access, movements, economy, expression, and embodiment. And so I encourage you, if you can, to take some time and look through it. It will be a resource that's shared with everybody. And these are quite comprehensive, and so we can't speak to them all, but I'm just going to mention a few that I think resonated with me the most. The first one being that a feminist internet starts with enabling women, all women, and gender diverse people's access. Access meaning acceptable, affordable, unconditional, meaningful, and equal access to the internet. And so this speaks to this growing discourse that we're increasingly having about internet being deemed an essential service. As our communications and our work and our school and our relationships have moved online because of the pandemic, it's essential then that everybody has equitable access, at the very least, to the internet to begin with. And so related to that then is this idea of access to information that is relevant to women and gender diverse peoples. And this includes information that's available in a diversity of languages, that's available for people of a diversity of abilities and interests and contexts. Specific to my work with sexual violence, and that has really come up in this conversation already, is the principle of expression. And that means the power of the internet to use to amplify your narratives, your voices, and the lived realities of women and gender diverse people. And so these principles are clear, as am I, that the internet and technology can be a place for healthy expression of intimacy and sexuality. People should not be shamed and or judged for engaging in sexual behavior over the internet or through communication technologies. When practiced safely and with consent, it can be a very healthy form of sexuality, intimacy, and connection. These principles, however, outline that these spaces need to be reclaimed by women and gender diverse peoples to resist this mainstream patriarchal heteronormative gaze often placed on women and gender diverse people, and instead place their desires and their safety at the center of these conversations. And so the conversation needs to gear more towards that. How do we place safety at the center of this, rather than statements of how that behavior is inappropriate, because it's not. And we need to build ethics and protocols of consent into the culture, design, the policies, the terms of service of these internet platforms, and then holding these key stakeholders accountable to their platforms that they've created, the rules and the regulations that they came out with. So yeah, I really do encourage people, if they do have some time, to look into these principles.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Rebecca. I guess on the topic of accountability, I wanted to ask you, thanks to the work of Black and Indigenous feminists and activists, we're now in a time where more and more people are actively discussing how the police and the broader justice system, have been perpetuating acts of racism, sexism, and colonialism. So continuing that, I guess, how do you envision ways where people could hold each other accountable outside of the punitive model of criminal law in a digital space, if you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I can start off. So yeah, so I think criminal law is such a troubling thing because I think it's so valuable to have the state recognize that these are harms and that these are problems. Like, I think there's value in having the state come out and say, we don't believe in this. Like, this is behavior we don't want in our society. You know, and so I appreciate when there's laws around these types of things that say that. But looking at the criminal justice system, we know that, you know, it disproportionately targets Indigenous and racialized communities. It hasn't necessarily created really positive change in the ways that I don't think, even if someone is incarcerated, so they come out on the other side, then recognizing, you know, that what they did was sexist, was misogynistic, and that they're actively working to change, you know. And so when I imagine models that would be really successful, I imagine models where there's a space for accountability, where, you know, people who have done these terrible acts, you know, are accountable for their actions, and then there's space for them to change, and there's community systems in place that support them to change their thoughts and beliefs, while at the same time also prioritizing the person who was harmed. And, you know, sending someone to prison doesn't give that person the resources they need to pay to get their photos taken offline, to change their phone numbers, to change their addresses if they've been doxxed. Like, a lot of online harassment is very expensive to fix, you know, and I think the way that our legal system is framed right now doesn't really provide the solutions that we need. And, you know, and one of the things I'd mentioned before was having these government bodies that are meant to support people in managing these types of conflicts. And we see the e-safety commissioner in Australia, and Pam Crick is writing this great chapter on some of the organizations that exist outside of the criminal law system. So I think there are other ways that we can support each other and get some of the solutions that they want. People want their content taken down fast, and the law is slow. You know, a criminal law case is going to take you 6 months to a year if you're lucky. Same thing with civil law, and some internet companies won't take content down unless you have a court order. You know, so we're in a bit of a pickle for, you know, how do you get content taken down without engaging in the criminal law system. But again, I think beyond this, the law should be the last solution. You know, what we need to do is we need to be looking to change people's concepts of this. And like what Rebecca was saying, how sharing nude photos has become so normalized that people don't even see it as something that's improper, or like young boys are creating, and adult men are creating spaces where they're collecting nude photos, like they're playing cards, and this has become a regular practice. So I think changing the culture around this and educating people on that, and having people rethink these ideas, which again goes back to what Hadia was saying, which is like going to the root problems, going to ending sexism, going to ending racism, and looking at systemic and structural issues.
Yeah, I would say it's like a misallocation of resources. I mean, if you think about our criminal law system, so much of the money goes into punishment of people. But, you know, if I am the victim of cybermisogyny, do I want the money to be spent housing that person in jail for 2 years? Or, you know, do I want a different form of justice? Do I want that person not to do it to somebody else? And I don't think that just putting that person in prison and not educating them or not getting to the root of why they did it in the first place is going to ensure that they don't do it again. So I think that our system tends to be overly punitive and not one that is restorative or really focused on changing behavior. And so, you know, if I was a victim, I would basically want that person to receive some sort of training or education, or for them to like get therapy to deal with the trauma that makes them do that or made them make that decision to do it. And I also want a lot of resources devoted to helping me be restored as much as I can to my previous state. So helping, as Susie mentioned, getting those images down, you know, getting rid of the negative effects on my life from that person's actions. But we spend so much money on the punitive element and not on the victim. But it's, you know, similar to, you know, the current discussions about defunding the police. Are the resources going to the right place to get to the root of these problems? You know, should that money be going to basically address misogyny so that the next generation of men have fewer people who are, you know, using those images and sharing those images? So I think the pandemic and the protests are really making us reimagine how we do justice and how we treat people and how just how we've set things up. You know, the police in the United States emerged from slave patrols. You know, like that's where the police came from. You know, when you think about like, what are the police for? The police are not for sexual assault victims. The police don't really stop crimes. They don't stop sexual assaults from happening. They often let sexual assault offenders off with a like, are you sure? Or making sure that those cases are unfounded. And, you know, I would expect the same, that cybermisogyny is not taken seriously by the police. And so I don't know if I don't think the criminal justice system is necessarily the right tool for addressing these issues.
I think that's a great point. And, you know, with discussion, as you mentioned, we are starting to really question the root and the role of the police, or how the justice system was set up. And often I hear that, you know, people are like, but what is the alternative? And we might not know that yet, but I think it's really important to keep imagining and keep the conversation going. Rebecca, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, for sure. I think the question is quite large and it's complex, and so I don't think the answer is completely clear as well. I think it's something that still needs to be spoken about and imagined, and continue to have these conversations. I think though it particularly needs to be talked about in terms of collaboration. And so having an answer to this question is going to take collaboration across sectors. And so that means bringing legal experts together, community organizations together, people with lived experience, et cetera, together to have these conversations. And so when approaching this question, I'm coming at it from a community organization perspective, an organization that's been involved in this work for some time, and we actively seek feedback and knowledge sharing opportunities from our colleagues across the country, again, doing this work on the ground and talking to people. And so I think it's important to point out how incredibly complex dealing with cybermisogyny is, and specifically when you're dealing with survivors of online sexual violence. And that is because, as we always want, we need to take a survivor-centered approach in how we handle any sort of accountability process. It needs to remain survivor-centered. And so that might look different for each individual based on their needs and their case. And so I can't speak to one necessarily umbrella clear answer, because I don't think there is one. Cybermisogyny and online violence, sexual violence, is incredibly complex. And so I think a response would have to be so as well. But one avenue I can speak to is taking more of a community response to incidences. And so incidents of online sexual violence often, and cybermisogyny in general, often are an attempt to isolate individuals. And so, for example, when you threaten to share someone's intimate images of someone, you're doing that potentially to make them feel isolated, to make them feel alone, and to hold their reputation hostage from them. And so in response to that push for isolation, it's important to rally community and help reminding that person that they are not alone, and that this is not their fault, and that there are individuals, and that there are groups and organizations and communities that are with them and that support them through that experience. And so taking more of a community response, so that we're talking about, and given that we're talking about the internet and online platforms, that community has the potential to be vast, to cross borders. And so it brings together people potentially from around the world in a movement and in solidarity. And I think we're seeing that now more than ever. And one specific example I can quickly talk to, one of my colleagues actually at YWCA Canada, Jennifer Lockerbie, she created a guide to social media moderation and myth busting. And so this guide breaks down possible response options in responding to negative comments online, particularly relating to cybermisogyny. And so she breaks down a spectrum of response options, starting with blocking, to calling out, to calling in, and then educating. And she also speaks to the different kinds of comments that you might receive. So derailing comments, different issue comments, scapegoating comments, malicious comments. And it's a great example of a community resource, a community organization putting this together and having to respond, how to respond in those situations. Again, not that this is going to cover everything, but it can be an example of something that's being created and thought about in response to that. I'll pass it back.
Thanks so much. This was a really great discussion, and I really appreciated hearing all of your insights. I know this is now 6:30, which was the proposed time for the end of the panel, but I'm hoping we can go a little bit longer to address at least a few of the questions that we've gotten. And I see a few questions here. So I think we'll end around 6:45, if that's okay with everybody. So let's see. There was a question that asked, what practical steps do you suggest for a woman who is a subject of online harassment? Have people had success taking complaints to the police? Is there a special branch of TPS with sensitivity? So this is a Toronto Police Service. What about complaining to platforms? And what civil legal remedies are available?
Yeah, I think there's some, so I think on the resource page that you're going to share later, one of the things that I've been doing in my research, as I'm doing my research, is anytime I come across an organization that's doing really good safety planning tips, because a lot of this, it's so much labor that we have to do, and it's so unfair that we have to do this labor, but there are like things that we can do, like, you know, two-factor authentication on our account so that it's harder for abusive partners to hack into them. Or some people have done things like, if you share a nude image with someone, you can watermark it so it says like your partner's name on it. So if that image ever gets shared, so if you have like one sexy image you really like, and you know you're sharing it to like different people you're dating or throughout your life, use it differently, you can watermark it saying like, oh, this is going to you know, whoever, and then if that image gets shared out, that's a way that you could tell that was the person the breach came from. So there's all sorts of like practical safety tips you can get. So if you they'll show the resource later, but on my website, it's like susiedunn.com/resources. And it's just all these amazing community organizations who do cybersecurity tips. All of that stuff is fantastic. There's groups doing really great work. And then when it comes to like the criminal response and the civil responses to it, the civil responses, we've seen very few cases that have actually made it through to trial. Those lawyers that I mentioned earlier, Molly Reynolds and Jillian Yatu in particular, are doing really interesting work in this area. And the thing about law is that often law doesn't get to court. You know, law is settled, legal disputes are settled before they get to trial. So often we don't get to see what the legal remedies end up being. But there are people who have seen some success, and the civil law cases that we have seen have had large damages awards, some upwards of $100,000. And then criminal law, we are seeing you know, successful criminal law cases where people are getting prosecuted. I think there's some challenges in going to in going to the police because it's a new area of law. So I often recommend that if someone is going to seek out a criminal support and wants to press charges, that, you know, talk to someone who might know what the laws are. You can go to that website, the Equality website. It lists all the laws there. And sometimes it's helpful to bring those laws with you so that if you run into a police officer who says, oh no, it's not a big deal, you know, like what happened to you isn't illegal, you can point to the law and be like, no, it's illegal. You know, or if you have like that case, for example, about the voyeurism case where someone took a screenshot during a live sex chat, it's helpful to have those things with you. But I don't know of any special branches in Ottawa that's doing that. There might be some in Toronto. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Susie. So if we can address the questions, we are planning on doing sort of a follow-up blog post from the organizations, and we will try to address some of them there as well. So another question I'd like to pose to the panelists is, I think there was, sorry, I lost my place here. I think there was a question about whether the youth engaging in cybermisogyny could be reduced if secondary school education introduced feminist studies or sexual education with a feminist lens.
Yes. I'm like, just get FARA into every school. But I think we have, in some schools, we have more cops than we have people who could educate students on consent and on, you know, just answer all the actual questions they have that are relevant. So again, you know, where are our resources going? What is that cop in that school actually doing? How is that helping students and not criminalizing youth, especially youth of color? Where would our resources be better spent? Our resources would be better spent on education and tackling things at their root, And so, I would like school boards, for example, to consider, a lot of school boards are now expelling police from their schools, and use that money and replace that with education, particularly education and consent, and give them that education early. Like 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds should know that they don't have to allow people to hug them, or that if someone has a picture of them and they don't want them to have it anymore, that they can take it back, or there's no early time to start this. Like, they should be getting this basically when they come out of the womb. And I think, again, it's just a matter of like, where do we put our money, and is it really going to help address things at the root cause?
Yeah, and I think the work that people like Rebecca are doing too is so important, just like collecting that information as well too, because so often when you're arguing for these things, it's good to have stats. So like people doing research into it, I think is quite important. And when you look at the change that was going to happen to our sex ed recently, like that was one of the things people were most outraged about, was that the internet didn't really exist on those previous sexual education modules, and now it's so important to talk about things like consent and sharing. And I'm really inspired by the younger generation and how respectful they often are in sharing their own like non-sexual images. Like, they check in, they're like, hey, do I look cute in this? Do you look cute in this? Like, I'm not going to post this unless we're all cute, and they check in, and they're starting to get a really great culture around image sharing, but the sexual stuff, and like the difference between, like, what's the difference between like fantasy and pornography, and then like realistic, different types of actual sexual experiences. Like, these are conversations that we need to have so that people can have like positive, pleasurable experiences on the internet, both sexually and, intellectually and creatively. And again, these are things that you can start talking about young, like consent is something you can talk about young. All of these things you can talk about young. And so having it in schools and having it in their sex ed curriculum, I think is incredibly important.
I just wanted to follow up. When I was talking about Farah, I meant Farah Khan. Follow her on Twitter if you don't already. And there's this really great new ad by the New Zealand government, I believe, that's got like these 2 sex workers who show up naked. And I highly recommend people go look at that. Search that out if you can. But that's an example of like, how we can do these things better.
I'll just quickly add that I have many thoughts around that question, but generally, yes, I think that these conversations need to, again, be happening earlier, because people are talking about sex earlier. People are engaged in these activities earlier. The internet exists. And so we need to act on that. We need to recognize that. We can't shy away from that idea and roll with that and act accordingly. And I think also a big part of that, again, that root cause, and that's part of education. That's why we educate. That's why we have these conversations, to try and prevent it, rather than taking a reactive approach to things, trying to prevent things from happening in the first place. Taking a preventative approach means educating, talking about it, being open about it, normalizing this conversation. And I also think this idea, again, of getting to the root cause and recognizing that what's happening online is very much a reinterpretation and an expression and a manifestation of what's happening offline. And so you can't look at the online world in isolation. You can't examine what's happening online in isolation. It's very much what's happening offline. Again, it's just getting reinterpreted in new ways because technology is new and the internet is new. So it's interpreted differently and it's happening in new ways, but it's stemming from that same place. And so if you're not having those offline conversations and dealing with these offline systems and how they're manifesting themselves online, you're never going to get to that root cause. And it's going to continue to happen in maybe new ways. And when you change laws, people will find different ways and such and such. And so until you deal with what's driving that issue and what's really that root cause, again, it's going to continue to happen. And so how do we get to that? We get to that through education. And the earlier we start with that, the better that is. And so that means implementing that in our curriculums as soon as we can and adjusting language accordingly. And so recognizing that, like, give kids credit. They know, they understand, they can understand what we're talking about when we talk to it at the right level, as we would with anybody, with accessible language and things like that. And so gearing our conversations to who our audience is, as we would normally do anyways, to do that with children and implement that into our schools as soon as possible. And it just seems to make so much sense. So I think 100% is something that we need to push forward for and keep having conversations about and push back when those things are threatened. as we did see people do. We need to continue that because this is essential conversations that we need to be having.
Sure. Thank you so much. So one last question, unfortunately. Someone asked, do the panelists have any resources or strategies on practicing safe digital consent?
There's a ton of, again, people are doing this work already. There's a ton of like safety guides out there. I think that there's particular apps that you can use if you are like, so Signal is an excellent chat app. Like I recommend it even just for regular conversations. It's encrypted, it's a good company. And then you can do things like you can have a timer on your chat. So like if you're getting into more intimate conversations that maybe you don't want a permanent record of, you can change the function of the app so it deletes after 5 seconds or 5 minutes or whatever you decide it to do. And that way your information is more likely to be deleted. There's always that risk someone's going to take a screenshot or someone's going to use their phone to take a picture over the thing, you know. So I think having conversations with your partner about what your boundaries are, you know, around, you know, digital sexual communication, and you can do things like you can talk about what they are and you can include that as a permanent saved piece of your conversation in your text to say like, okay, we agree that like we'll share photos, but they're always deleted. Or if we ever break up, you promise that you'll delete them. I don't give you consent to share them. And so those things are in there. And I think it's important to have those conversations as it is. I think Hadi is correct that like there is risk with taking nude images. They can get hacked, they can get shared, people break up and turn into jerks. So there's always that risk out there. And once the content is out there, it's very difficult to get it taken down. So the risk can be high, but I think a lot of people are engaging in very healthy sexual behaviors. And a lot of it is just healthy trust and communication. Even if you're taking permanent photos that you're keeping on your phone and not deleting, like in healthy, trusting relationships, they don't get shared. You know, and so I think part of it's conversation and part of it's tech, but I do think using certain apps like Tech or Signal, and there's certain apps that you can use that help you have those conversations with your partner if you're uncomfortable starting them. So there are resources out there.
For me, I think it's like a watermarked Polaroid. That's the only safe. And even then they can still take a picture, but at least like have a giant watermark over it so that you know who did it. But even if they, you know, you'll know who did it, but it's still out there, right? If someone releases it with the watermark. So again, you're not going to get your full justice because it might not be able to get rid of that photo, but I mean, you'll at least know who the perpetrator is. But for me, I'm just steering clear of the internet because there's no level of risk that I'm willing to accept. So that just will have its own consequences, but lo-fi.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. And like, again, it's an individual decision and it's an individual thought process that needs to happen and weighing that risk. But also then if you do choose to engage in it and someone were to share it without your consent, knowing that that is not on you, and that being very clear about that. And there are great resources out there that really do outline, hey, do you want to sext? Great. This is how to do so safely. And being very open and honest about that conversation. Again, normalizing this practice, and because the more we normalize it, the more we can talk about it and how to do so safely. If it's a taboo subject, people aren't going to talk about it. And that includes not talking about how to engage in that practice safely. And so the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, the more we can be open to having conversations about doing so safely and not having to keep it a secret or be ashamed of it. If you bring it up into the forefront, we can talk about how to do it safely and recognize that a lot of people are doing it. And so how do we do so safely? And prioritizing, again, centering your safety at the forefront of everything in this. And so there are breakdowns of this is what you should say. This is how you define your boundary and what consent looks like in your relationship. Saying who these photos are for, in what capacity are they for? Are they to be saved? Are they just for that particular moment? Being very clear with your expectations of somebody, documenting that, making it very clear the interaction that you've had in preparing for that online sexual relationship. So taking note of that. There are great resources out there that break that down. And again, just normalizing this conversation and this practice so people feel more comfortable being open and talking about it rather than being ashamed of having done it in the first place, I think is a big part of it.
That's great. Thank you so much. So with that, I'm going to bring the session to a close. Wanted to thank Hadia, Susie, and Rebecca for sharing so much incredible insights and resources today. And I also wanted to thank everyone who joined. I saw some happening and resources being shared there as well. So thank you so much for your engagement. As a follow-up, we will be preparing a recap of the event with some of the insights learned, and we'll be sharing all the resources that were referenced there as well. And we're planning to publish that on our website, so look out for that. And if you'd like to support our work, you can visit the YWCA and LEAF websites to see how you can get involved or donate if you're in the position to do so. With all that, I wanted to say thank you so much. I learned a lot. I hope everybody here did as well. And wishing you the great rest of your week. Thank you.